result, such police efforts both preserve and perpetuate inequalities based on race and class. So thus far, I focused chiefly on the hard side of repression, the direct coercion, the forceful disruptions, the criminalization and incarceration, and implicit in all of those, the violence. Now we need to look at the soft side, the strategic use of concessions, the promise of repression and access, the co-optation of leadership, and comprising all these, the institutionalization of dissent. These elements represent, at this point, the state's most typical response to opposition from the left. And by these means, the state doesn't just achieve control and exercise power over organizations of the left, but also through them. I've already mentioned the use of social services in black churches to create a network of capacity to legitimize, fund, equip, and carry out Boston's Operation Ceasefire. The collaboration of social workers, the clergy, and public defense attorneys for similar ends in Newark, police-sponsored youth and elders programs in Salinas, and in Los Angeles, a plan to use social service agencies to gain access to Muslim communities suspected of breeding terrorists. But sometimes police-led partnerships go further, using progressive nonprofits to channel and control political opposition, moving it in safe, institutional, and reformist directions, rather than toward more radical or militant action. For example, consider the efforts of liberal nonprofits to contain community anger after transit police shot and killed an unarmed black man in Oakland, California. Oscar Grant was killed on January 1st, 2009. A week later, on January 7th, a protest against the police turned into a small riot. Organizers with the Coalition Against Police Executions, or CAPE, a group largely composed of progressive nonprofits and black churches, denounced the crowd's violence. Then, in an effort to reassert its leadership, CAPE organized another demonstration for January 14th. Speakers there included the mayor, Ron Dellums, the rapper Too Short, and representatives of various nonprofits, all of whom urged the crowd to remain peaceful. Furthermore, CAPE's designated marshals, operating under the supervision of a private security guard, surrounded the demonstration while unidentified informants mingled with the crowd to look for troublemakers. Despite the tight control, things did not go as planned. When the speeches were over, much of the crowd simply refused to leave. Organizers announced that police would intervene if the group would not disperse, but rather than wait, CAPE's own marshals formed a line and began pushing people off the streets. The crowd grew very angry and started breaking windows. The security team then withdrew from the area and left it to the cops to handle the crowd. The police, of course, fired tear gas and made arrests. Future demonstrations, beginning on January 30th, were likewise handled with threats, arrests, and violence. At the same time, and in keeping with the counter-insurgency model, local, state, and federal agencies all undertook extensive intelligence operations targeting protest organizers, monitoring websites, videotaping crowds, sending plainclothes officers to demonstrations, and infiltrating planning meetings. A year later, as the cop, Johannes Messerly, approached trial, Nicole Lee, the director of the nonprofit Urban Peace Movement, circulated an email focused not on winning justice, but on preventing violence should justice be denied. Titled, Bracing for Messerly Verdict, Community Engagement Plan, the June 23, 2010 memo offered two sets of instructions. Quoting here from the memo. Number one, create organized events or avenues for young people and community members to express their frustrations with the system in constructive and peaceful ways. Number two, inoculate our bases in the community at large so that when the verdict comes down, people are prepared for it and outside agitators are not able to incite the crowd. The memo then listed several talking points which served the state's interests so well that the city of Oakland ran an edited version on its webpage. Around the same time, another organization, ironically named Youth Uprising, sponsored a public service announcement centered on the slogan, "Violence is not justice." The video includes local rappers, civil rights attorneys, school administrators, representatives from nonprofits, a police captain, and the district attorney of San Francisco, all urging a peaceful response to the verdict. Religious leaders also got into the act, using the pulpit to ask people to remain safely at home when the verdict was announced. These pacifying efforts, though broadly distributed, were centrally coordinated. Shortly before the trial, the mayor and police held a meeting with several Bay Area nonprofits. The topic, of course, was the prevention of riots. In practice, avoiding unrest became the primary focus of the institutionalized left. CAPE's stated goal, the prevention of police brutality, receded into the background. If anything, by condemning the rioters and cooperating with the cops, liberal leaders helped to legitimize the police counterattack and made further brutality more rather than less likely. In the end, Officer Messerly was convicted but of a lesser charge, manslaughter rather than murder. And when the verdict was announced, rioting did ensue. Hundreds of people, mostly young people of color, braved not only the clubs and the tear gas of the police, but also the condemnation of their purported community leaders. So I'm going to stop there. And if there are questions, I will do my best to answer them. And if there are counter arguments, I'd be glad to entertain them. And if there are other things people want to talk about, now's your chance. Yeah, please.
I was wondering if any of your books deal with specific police strategies for containing social, like not necessarily protests, but just like any gathering of crowd, like how exactly they go about doing that?
Yeah, in Our Enemies in Blue, there's a chapter devoted to the history of crowd control as it's emerged, especially over the 20th century, called Riot Police or Police Riots. And it traces out this history where the police used to rely solely on the threat and then the use of force, and took a very, what we now call a zero-tolerance approach to public disorder. And then that turned out very badly for them in the civil rights and anti-war period of the 50s and 60s, because faced with a tactic of nonviolent law-breaking, the cops were then shown, beating nonviolent protesters and releasing police dogs on church-going black folk in their Sunday best, and spraying down high school students with fire hoses and that sort of thing. And the result was that the police could win tactically on the street and consistently lost politically, because the harder they came down with those protests, the more popular the protests became, the more public sympathy shifted toward the protesters as opposed to toward the authorities. So following that, they came up with a new strategy called negotiated management, where they identify responsible leaders, and there's an implicit give and take between the cops and the leaders, where the cops give them a lot more leeway to do things like have their demonstrations or take the streets, or sometimes even accommodate civil disobedience as long as it's purely symbolic. And the leaders then keep it in a very limited, non-disruptive framework. That held until until precisely November 30th, 1999, when the WTO protests in Seattle took advantage of the cops' negotiations and then just went ahead and disrupted the city anyway. And the police were completely caught off guard for it, and they reverted just back to something very much like negotiated management. Now, Our Enemies in Blue is about 10 years old, so I basically, or they reverted back to something like escalated force. Our Enemies in Blue is about 10 years old, so I basically stopped the story at that point. More recent research shows that what the direction the police are moving now is what Pat Gilham and John Noakes have referred to as strategic incapacitation, where they, rather than taking a framework of negotiation, the police basically just still meet with responsible leaders ahead of time and just dictate what the parameters are going to be. And groups that are willing to work within those parameters, they accommodate. And groups that are not willing to work within those parameters, they repress with something like escalated force. And so there's a major emphasis there on using intelligence to separate at the outset good protesters from bad protesters. And then they get treated differently accordingly. There's also a major focus now, and this is borrowed straight from the counterinsurgency literature, on controlling the narrative around protests, where police want to start messaging about the protest before the protest is even publicly announced. And then the police tell the story of how the protest happens. And if it goes really well, the police take credit for having like successfully accommodated this exercise of free speech. And if it goes really badly, then the police have already set it up to blame the bad protesters for ruining everybody's parade. Yeah, please.
Mr. Williams, after your recitation of the legal and social injustices which are readily apparent to any American that's interested in looking at the problem, do you favor abolishing or dismantling the state rather than reforming it? And if so, what do you envision the many pensioners and people that depended on Social Security and other state-funded programs, how they would cope or how they would survive in the event that the state were collapsed or dismantled?
Okay, that's a good question. So the short answer, I guess, is that I'm in favor of abolishing the state. I'm going to come back and complicate that in a minute. But I don't think that we can just, like, I don't know, flip a switch, state goes off, and everything's going to be fine. Because it does provide for the needs of parts of the population. And there are parts of the population that rely on it. So it's not enough just to pretend like the same society with no government is going to be better. What we need to do instead is we need to develop other means to make sure that people get their needs met. And those being means that the community can control itself, that we don't rely on these representative and coercive institutions to do. So,
and much like the Republicans would advocate then that charity should be community or church-based rather than based on the government supplying it.
I mean, no, because they are cynically putting that forward as a way of defunding those programs that people rely on, knowing that there isn't the alternative institutions to carry that load. I think we need to develop those institutions, the institutions that can do it as we shut down the parts of the state we don't like. I also happen to think that there are parts of the state that we would be better off capturing rather than abolishing. The public library is probably the example that comes to mind first. Now, the reason that I said the short answer is that I'm going to abolish it, and then I'm going to come back and complicate that, is while there are parts of the state, the police, the prisons, basically the criminal justice apparatus as a whole especially, the enforcement of the border is another example, that I think ultimately cannot be reformed. I also think that there are reforms that we can pursue in the meantime as a way of building a movement that then has the strength to abolish it. And the thing about that is we need to be careful to only pursue those reforms that open up the possibility for more action, as opposed to pursuing reforms that lead us into blind alleys and shut down the possibility of action. So that's a strategic question rather than like a question of principle. But I think both in terms of strategy, the way of building a movement, and then also in terms of like basic decency, in terms of the suffering that those institutions create is so severe that anything that we can do that's going to reduce it ultimately, we should pursue. Please.
I would be interested in knowing if you had an example of if any of those reforms that you think are leading into a generative, positive direction, if any of them are being carried out right now, or if any reforms that you think are leading to blind alley are being carried out right now.
Yes to both. Anytime people oppose, for example, the construction of a new jail, I mean, ultimately that's like a fairly modest thing. It's not even really an improvement, right? It's just holding the status quo. In some ways, a very conservative kind of action. It's a very conservative kind of position. But we know from experience that if we build the jails, they will fill them. And so, so fighting to prevent a new jail from being built, I think, does have the possibility. Let me start that again. doesn't have the danger of making things worse, does have the possibility of exposing larger and larger numbers of people to the criticism of the prison system, and also has the possibility of getting people who are concerned about that, giving them practical organizing experience, winning something, developing the camaraderie and the morale that they then need to like carry on to more ambitious campaigns. In terms of the things that I think do lead us into blind alleys, let's see. Basically, anytime some administrator offers to get together a representative panel and study some problem, that is a reliable tactic for wasting the time of people who would otherwise be doing some organizing. And the hope is that at the end, they then make some policy recommendations that may affect something somehow. Sometimes they do, usually not. But at the end, what they do is they promote an idea of social change where we win it by getting experts to sit down with policy leaders and like advise them, as opposed to a model of social change that it happens because people organize and build movements that then pressure the authorities to do things that we want them to do.
I have another question.
Sure.
If that's okay. It's
Yes.
slightly unrelated. And it's in reference to the ComSAT program. This may be a silly comparison. I'm trying to understand. I'm sort of seeing it as similar to or analogous to like using your rewards card at a grocery store and they track what you buy or the cookies or something. And my question would be: is that sufficiently general to be able to like mess with the data that it's collecting purposefully? Like, would there be a way to sabotage that system?
The police are very good at sabotaging that system.
Yeah.
One of the, I think, mistakes that William Bratton made when he introduced the ComSAT system in New York is that they didn't just use it to track crime and then deploy resources. They also used it to discipline commanders and even low-level officers responsible for the areas where crime was happening. So if you're, again, like, you can see this dramatized in, I think, the third season of The Wire. Like, a lot of the plot revolves around exactly this question. And the technical stuff in that is actually pretty accurate, for what that's worth. But if you're, a precinct commander and there are increasing bike thefts in your precinct, once a week you're going to go and you're going to stand in a room like this that's full of other precinct commanders, and you're going to have to like show slides and explain that the bike thefts are up, and then you're going to be grilled by both your peers and your commanders of what you're doing about the bike thefts and what you're trying and why they're going up. And if you go some amount of time and the numbers aren't dropping, then they're going to take you out, they're going to put somebody else in your spot, and you're going to be like, I don't know, working in the property room or something. So that built in an incentive for the cops, and then that trickles down, right? Like, so the precinct commander goes back to his sergeants and chews them out because bicycle thefts are going up. And then the sergeants at roll call, like come down on the patrol officers. And this isn't like just happenstantial. This is like, Bratton wrote a whole book about how this works, and he explicitly argues that this is how the system is supposed to work. And then the idea is that like, everybody's getting like, everyone's being really motivated, as he puts it. And so the patrol officers go out and like kick a bunch of ass, and like, people stop stealing bikes, right? Or more likely, they go to the next precinct over and steal those bikes. Becomes somebody else's problem. But actually what happened a lot of the time is that at every level there was pressure to not necessarily reduce bike theft, just to stick with my example, but to reduce the numbers of reports of bike theft. And so cops started juking the numbers, which meant that they would stop taking reports of theft and instead file reports of lost property, for example. It's like, well, somebody misplaced their bike. Nothing we can do about it. Similarly, people who advocate for ComStat have argued that no, this isn't real, this happened. And a couple of high-level commanders like got caught with their hand in the cookie jar and like lost their jobs because of this. A little bit later, the city of New York was looking at reducing the police budget because like crime's way down. Like they don't need to keep throwing millions of dollars at it. And the head of the police union had a press conference where he said, actually crime isn't way down, we're just lying to you. And so people who defend it are like, yeah, so that happened in small ways, but not importantly, and the best measure of crime is looking at homicide rates, right? Because like, if there is a body, people notice, right? And that's like the most reliable crime statistics. Interestingly, a couple of criminologists did some serious statistical work and determined that in New York at the period where the murder rate was falling, the suicide rate was going up and the accidental death rate was going up at exactly the right proportion to balance it out. So you still have the same number of dead bodies, they're just being classified differently. Which is why I said that ComStat's effect on actual crime is debatable. So the cops have figured out how to like screw this up. The question is like, could we do something similar, right? Or like people in the community. And with ComStat, it's hard to know how exactly. With other of the statistical, the sort of, the demographic profiling that they do, probably you could feed some bad information into the system, but it works at such a general level that probably that would just get like written out as error. And at the end, the thing that's interesting about counterinsurgency as opposed to like old school detective work is that old school detective work was interested in specifics. It was interested in specific crimes and finding, the person who did some act. And counterinsurgency largely shifts away from that and instead looks to broad patterns and probabilities. So they don't really need to know, what house the bombing plot was going to originate in. They just need to know what neighborhood, right? And then once they identify that, they can start using things like informants and wiretaps and other more reliable means to narrow it down. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
I'm going to see if you want to talk. Yeah, want to talk. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so you were saying that in LA and other major cities, they were going into Muslim communities and trying to narrow down the people with violent ideologies from the regular Muslim community. Do they do similar work in communities that are more united by politics? And if so, like, how does that work? And maybe some examples of that.
Right. Okay, so, I mean, it's pretty easy to just like, yes, they do. And it's pretty easy to just make the analogy, right? So, what were some of the things that they talked about doing in the Muslim community? Well, they were talking about listening in on conversations at hookah bars and restaurants, right? So, surely there's some coffee shop where dirty anarchists hang out. Surely there's some bar where, like, I don't know, animal rights kids go and get vegan beer, right? It is not that hard to get some, somebody who got busted with, like, I guess not pot here, but something, to work off their charge by going and spending some certain amount of time, like hanging out in a bar on the city's dime and then reporting back about what they hear, right? They send somebody to the mosque, they listen to sermons, they send somebody to lectures at Evergreen, they listen to what's said there. It's the same sort of thing. Similarly, probably the most nefarious of the things that they've done is they've sent people into, they send people into those populations where that they think are ripe for this kind of thing. with the idea of finding impressionable, overeager, hapless young people and convincing them to engage in some sort of bomb plot. And then they arrest them for the bomb plot. And you know, Trevor Aronson just wrote a book on this a few months ago called The Terror Factory that looks really specifically at how the FBI especially has concocted these bomb plots. And he specifically looks at the Muslim community. But we see the same thing in the environmental movement. I mean, a guy named Eric David is doing something more than 20 years for conspiring to build a bomb where there was never a bomb, largely at the instigation of an FBI informant. Similarly, the two people doing felony time after the Republican National Convention in 2008 were put up to making Molotov cocktails by an FBI informant. Similarly, the NATO 3, the Cleveland 4, like it's basically the same story over and over again, that like people who are feeling really urgent about needing to do something about the injustice that they see, and also don't have particularly clear ideas on what should be done, fall under the sway of somebody usually older, usually seeming like claiming experience, usually very charismatic, and often also a bully, who then persuades / pressures / tricks them into engaging in conspiracy, and then they end up doing serious time. And that tactic is like exactly the same from in the Muslim community and then like the anarchist movement and the environmental movement. Also, interestingly, it emerged from the war on drugs. Aronson tracks a very clear lineage from the no bomb busts, which is what the FBI calls this, to no drug busts that started in the 80s, where they would persuade people to like move a large amount of cocaine for them, and you know, there was not even any cocaine, and then people were doing large amounts of time for conspiring to sell imaginary drugs. Yeah, please, in the back.
Is there evidence of the press working with law enforcement?
Yeah, yes. Although most of the most sort of professional media outfits have pretty strict policies about not sharing material that they haven't published with anyone, right? And there are some professional ethics reasons for that, and there are some like copyright reasons for that, and that sort of thing. But cops, and especially the FBI, have cultivated special relationships with particular journalists. And they've been, like, J. Edgar Hoover really, like, perfected this, starting in the 1930s. And he would, you know, have a columnist in, you know, Topeka. And when he needed, and this worked both ways, right? So, like, he needs information, he would call the columnist and be like, see what your newspaper files have on these people, right? And then he would also, you know, leak them information that would be useful for him. And sometimes the FBI would go so far as to like write the news articles and contact the editor, and the editors would run it. So in a backdoor way, and usually relying on individual relationships rather than institutional relationships,